All right, so welcome to the PM Hive Podcast again. Welcome, Young. You are another special guest for our episode. Today, Young is actually a software engineer, and I'll let you introduce yourself thereafter, but I just wanted to let everyone know that we are kicking this episode off with a special kind of collaborative experience with our topic today about the ways that PMs can work with developers properly. So that's going to be kind of like the main focus part, and we'll talk around some other parts as well. But just, Young, I just wanted to let you get your chance to introduce yourself.
For sure. Thank you so much, Kasey. And I'm very, very happy and to be honored a little bit to be part of your podcast. So to give everybody a little bit introduction about myself, I'm a software engineer, staff level at a company called Applyboard, which is located in Waterloo. And as a staff engineer, I work in the fintech team currently, and I used to work on the platform team, which created tooling for other engineers to use.
Got it. That's awesome. I know we talked a little about this when we did meet up on our kind of one-on-one session about it, but I just wanted to ask bluntly, why did you become a software engineer? And I'm sure some people listening to this podcast would want to ask you the same thing.
Oh, that's a great question. The reason I became a software engineer, have quite a few stories that's behind it. So initially, when I went to university, I wanted to become a doctor. Like all Asian parents want their kids to become a doctor. So I went into the microbiology route because it prepared me a little bit more with the MCAT. However, unfortunately, I could not get into medicine, and I had to think about like what's my next step. So I decided to go with electrical engineering because it was challenging, it was hard. So I'm like, and also I like mathematics, so why not go into electrical engineering? And at the end of my electrical engineering degree, I had an epiphany because of a capstone project I was doing, which is wireless body network. And I found that there is a nice intersection between electrical engineering and microbiology where I can help people. And I thought that the other ingredient which I was missing was software engineering, which connects the hardware, the software, and the life science together.
Interesting.
Right. So that was the reason why I said to myself, hey, you know what? I want to dig a little bit deeper into software development. And initially, it was really difficult because I didn't have much experience with software. And this funny thing is, when I was electrical engineering, people were asking me, hey, why don't you take more software courses? And I'm like, I don't want to sit in front of a computer all day coding. That's not something I foresee myself doing. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a job quickly within the 6 months after I graduated. So I was trying to pick up whichever job I can. And it turned out a startup that was interested in me. And I was lucky to get that particular job. And I've been doing software engineering ever since.
Interesting. So I guess I kind of wanted to pick that part apart a little bit, that entire journey you described. When that startup reached out to you, is that Applyboard today, or is that something else and you transitioned eventually to Applyboard?
Right. So I might have missaid a little bit about things. So it's a startup where my friend used to work at, and she said, hey, you'll be a really good fit here because I know you're a very competent engineer, even though that this is a company with AI and all sorts of things, machine learning. But I think you'll be a good fit. So basically, she kind of reached out to her manager and said, hey, you know what? I have a friend who is looking for a job. Why not set up this particular interview? And that's how I got into my first job. And it was not Applyboard, which is the company I'm currently working with. It's a startup called Sightline, which is located in Winnipeg.
Awesome. Interesting.
Yeah.
When they interviewed you, or whenever you were having coffee chats with people at that startup or outside of it, did anyone ever ask you, like, why did you do this bio degree at first and then you transitioned to the electrical engineering? Did anyone ever actually try to touch that topic?
Absolutely. I think people are quite curious about my background because it is quite non-traditional, and the fact that I did 2 degrees that's irrelevant to software engineering, it makes people wonder why I'm going towards that particular route. It's absolutely true. Yeah.
Interesting. And then I guess when you finally did start traveling through that software engineering journey, you were learning the insights and outs of product development, right? Working with PMs, working with other engineers within an engineering ecosystem, working with designers and marketing. I'm assuming that's going to be a little bit. And I typically find that, in my experience, experiences working with other developers is the engineering director has the privilege to allow their team, a set of engineers, to get to try to communicate more and actually be more cross-collaborative across the whole product team.
That's right.
Which I feel like is a really good best practice. So do you feel like kind of through your experiences, is that how you discovered what PM is, what other developers, how other developers, so to speak, kind of just work with PMs and designers and whatnot? And how has that experience been like so far?
That is also another great question. For me, because my background is mostly in startups, so being like Sideline was a startup with about 12 to 20 people, and then I keep on moving throughout startups. So from my initial software engineering experience, I didn't get to work with true product managers that much. The most I've been working with are perhaps project managers, where the majority of their tasks is more so managing tickets and whatnot. So it's only after a little bit, after getting into my previous job, I start working with product managers a little bit closely, and I start realizing the importance of having a product manager. And that was a company called Felix Health. It was a company based in Toronto that's tried to improve the efficiency where people can get their prescriptions a little bit easier. And at that company, I worked with a product manager who is very super competent, and I started to realize I actually don't understand everything about the product they're trying to build, and most of the product I was trying to build before is much more engineering related. It's much more engineering focused. So when I was given a particular task, I kind of think about, okay, this is a technical task. This is how I'll dive in and how would I solve it. But within that healthcare startup, it was much more different. It's about going to a particular domain, have no understanding about, and having a PM who is very, very knowledgeable, and I was able to communicate with her at equal footing, at equal level, made me feel like it was a really collaborative process. And I felt, wow, this is how software engineer is, this is how development should be, having a product manager that really knows their stuff, and then having the right vision to say, hey, you know what, this is the trade-off we want to make, and this is the direction we want to go to, versus someone who is like, asking me, are you done your task? Or like, hey, here's a ticket, like here's a sprint, like, how come you did not finish a certain task?
Interesting. Okay. I feel like, unfortunately, there are those types of, TPMs, project managers, program managers who are kind of going through that former description that you described, as well as those that product managers who are more focused on the vision and the description of how do we want to get there and why do we want to get there, right? And which I feel like is super important because I've had the honor and the privilege to work with both types of PMs as well.
Right.
And I feel like for startups, that's interesting because typically speaking from startups, PMs are usually wearing multiple hats. Like a lot of the work that they're doing, and I'm sure even from a developer's perspective, a lot of the work that you're doing is not always just going to be touching code all the time.
That's right.
Especially from a startup perspective, because there's a lot of things you can figure out, technical analysis to do, exploring different options and evaluating the cost benefits of it.
Right.
And I guess once you moved to Applyboard, which was a little bit bigger startup.
Yes, absolutely.
Was that experience working with PMs as well as like what the development work that you were doing a little bit different?
It was absolutely different because initially I was working on a platform team, which meant it was not our product is not really outward facing, it's not customer facing, it's more internal facing. And the product we're building is engineering facing, basically. So from that particular perspective, it was still quite easy for me to understand what the ask is. However, as I started to move into a more product-facing team, such as a fintech team, things became a little bit more different. There's much bigger challenges in terms of understanding, for example, what the actual requirements are, in terms of why we're doing certain things, which should be answered by product management. However, there are a lot of uncertainties in there. So there's a lot of back and forth from the engineers to the product managers to kind of get the clarifications. For example, why are we going towards this approach? Like, for example, how when we're doing this particular automation, how much efficiency are we going to bring into our company? Is it worthwhile? Because, for example, if you're bringing efficiency to automate a few applications a day versus 1,000 applications a day, there's a particular trade-off. There's a certain threshold where it makes sense to go into this particular automation versus, hey, you know what, let's not touch it for now. Let's focus on the things that are going to bring us more revenue, bring us more students into our business.
I think at that point in time, really having that domain of expertise and understanding of it, but even at least showing the curiosity and then the interest of wanting to learn and then apply that why to how we're building it is a great way for PMs to really start building that relationship with developers. I feel, at least from my experience. But that actually goes down to my next question, which I'm sure like we had a long talk about it, and I'm sure we could probably dive a little bit deep into it too. Because despite all of this, right, like the best practices are easy to hear when we're saying it, but then when we try to apply it, it's much difficult, especially when we have to get into the actual weeds of it, writing the epics, writing the stories, actually doing translating those stories into actual development code, and then committing that code, and then you realizing like I didn't want this, I didn't expect this, I didn't expect this dependency, or like for example, this technical analysis like completely describe the fact that we have to do this, push this back by a month or so, something like that.
Right.
There's all these small intricacies and these small nuances that you start realizing as you get into the weeds of product development, working with a PM, a TPM, or whoever is like kind of working with you to push that product to that certain direction, right?
Right.
So I guess my next question is like, just to start off, to keep it simple, like, do you feel like there are those general disconnects? And I guess like are there ways that you feel like disconnects can happen continuously if we can continue going down that path, right? So I guess like the first question is just, so do you feel like there are those disconnects?
Absolutely, there are disconnects. And the way I see the disconnects is somewhat inevitable, because the way I see how the way I see how the company operates is that, for example, we have a CEO who sets a particular strategic vision, and that propagate down to, for example, the directors, the product managers, and they have a much higher scope of knowledge than developers do. So there's ought to be some particular there's ought to be some sort of disconnects, and then that knowledge transfer is not getting into the developers. Otherwise, the developer would have to know everything. For example, the visions and the product visions and why we're doing certain things. There's a lot more information that the engineers have to encapsulate into their head to be able to make a good product. So I feel like there's got to be some sort of information encapsulation as well. The product manager needs to know some of the information and pass part of it down to the engineers, and the engineers to take part of that and then start creating a particular product. But I think I think the more difficult part is what kind of information should be passed between the engineers to the product managers. A lot of times, product managers say, "Hey, you know what? This is an implementation detail. You guys go figure it out." I want to make like example, like for example, making Google from a product perspective could be as simple as, hey, create a search box that return me all the web pages that you're interested in. It seems like on paper seems like pretty reasonable. It's easy to describe, and everything after that is a engineering journey of how to figure out the problem. However, if this was given to any sort of team or any engineers, they will be really confused on exactly how this could be implemented, because without the background knowledge of how a search engine works and all sorts of things, how could we even get started onto it, even though the product requirement seems to be quite straightforward. And I think this is where the product management and the engineers need to really collaborate together and then start talking about this type of business requirements from a technical perspective as well. It cannot just be from a business perspective. As long as a business makes sense, and then engineers need to be able to implement it. And everything we just defer to the engineers, right?
Right.
I think it's just, we cannot go all the way to just product manager giving us a vision and letting us build everything, but we cannot also go the other side where the product manager says, hey, you know what? I want to know everything about the technical aspect of it, and I want to dictate every part of technical decisions either. There's a fine line between too much and too little collaboration, and I'm not sure if there is some way to say, hey, you know what, this is a perfect equilibrium to be at. I think this depends on the team, but one thing for sure, there has to be a lot of collaboration between the product manager. There has to be a lot of trust between the product manager and software engineers.
And despite you describing that, there is that kind of fine line, I feel like, from a different angle, I always see it as that fine line always changes based on the team, based on who the PM is hiring for, and then what the developers are, right? And what their expectations are.
Right.
Every team seems to be different, and that's dictated by a lot of external factors. For example, is a startup? Is it like a large corporation where that fine line is probably less detail oriented?
Right.
Or it's something like a startup where you obviously want to get into the weeds as a PM still, just so simply because there's so many things that you could be hands-on with, right?
Right.
So that fine line, I always feel like from my experience working in big tech, medium-sized companies and startups, it's always different because I get used to like a fine line of, okay, fine, you want me to describe the exact key results, the KRs that we're working on, but not only that, but you want me to fully, deeply understand the AI ML models, non-transformer GPT models, whatever we're building that to improve this feature or product or whatever.
Right.
So for example, at Microsoft, within a small, I guess not necessarily small, but I was working in a platform team. And because it was a platform team, and I'm sure you probably know because you worked in the platform team too, is the PMs have to be technical, simply because they so we were working more in like as a TPM sort of role because instead of dictating strategy, that strategy was a very collaborative process with the engineering directors because it was a platform product.
Right.
And also simply because it was very heavily engineering culture and engineering driven.
Right.
All the slide decks did not look like consulting slide decks. They looked like just numbers thrown onto a screen. And whenever we were trying to present to the VPs, they were like, I can't read this. And, the counter argument was always, we're engineers or we're technical PMs. We don't care about that. We're trying to describe to you how we're achieving success.
Right.
So that's that kind of weird, funny things, but I digress. The really kind of the real point I'm trying to make is like, at least within that platform team, because we were so engineering focused, a lot of the work that I was doing felt really granular. And so it was less strategy focused simply because it was such a technical product. So I didn't have that fully, holistic understanding of where we needed to go because I didn't know enough technical detail. And also because I come from a non-traditional background too. So there was like a large learning curve for me to just really get myself familiarized with this whole entire platform. But then on the flip side, in my new role, it's very business and strategy focused, and I feel like obviously it's given that with my background, it's a little bit of a better fit for me because of that. Developers have different expectations, but I just had to get used to it. So I started, what happened was when I started my new job at PlanView, I was not just writing epics. I was like trying to get into the fine line details of like, what are these stories? What models are we using? What's the code base? What's the architecture? Because I think I almost had to train myself out of it because that's what Microsoft was expecting from like a platform team perspective.
Right.
So I guess like to answer your question or to kind of follow up on what you were answering, there's that fine line, but there's that dependency aspect too. And do you feel like kind of like if you were to, I guess, go from, maybe your current company Applyboard to somewhere else, or you're coming from somewhere else to Applyboard or wherever you are, you would have to maybe like look into what the team culture and expectations are for product development and what the PM's expectations are, right? And the expectations from developers for PMs is going to be, and establish that really early on.
Right.
So there's no like kind of miscommunication, whatnot. There's a good fine line of trust, like you mentioned as well, right? You feel like there's kind of like that weird difference where you're gonna have to get used to that new product development process and those expectations every single time you change teams.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that team dynamic is quite important. Like one of the first thing I do when I join a company is trying to get a feel for like, hey, how is the team operating? What is the product manager's role? Sometimes they're a little bit more technical and then they dive deep into working with the developers on the technical stuff. But then sometimes developer will be like, hey, you know what? Why are you talking about these technical things? These are actually implementation details.
Right.
Let us handle that. Right? They tell us what's your particular bigger vision. Like what are we optimizing for, regardless which technology we're using.
Yeah.
What's the KPI of the product we're trying to build, right? Sometimes they get a little bit too much into the weed, and we're like, hey, you know what, back off a little bit. And sometimes they're not giving us enough, and then we're like, hey, you know what, give us more information about the vision that you have, about the product you're trying to build, and so that we're on the same page. So I think there's a lot of back and forth, and it really depends on the team. It depends on your own curiosity as an engineer, and the only way to go forward is to work collaboratively as a team and then find that right balance. And as you mentioned as well, that balance also shifts and changes depending on what kind of product you're building as well. So if we're building a very technical product, having a non-technical PM in there will feel super painful because as you dig deeper into the particular product, the non-technical product manager, if they don't know the technical aspect of it, cannot break down the problem into smaller pieces. And that is the critical problem. If you cannot break down a large technical problem into smaller problems, then in their particular vision, it's just something incremental and easy to do. But then the work is then left by the engineer themselves. And at that moment, the engineers have a choice. They either make the decision themselves, which might not align with the business objective, or they have to take on the roles of the they have to take on the roles of engineers plus the mentorship role to the PM themselves to say, hey, you know what? I think for this particular project, you might have misunderstanding in terms of complications or implications of the technical decisions we're making. Yep. So let's have a one-to-one trying to educate each other about hey, why this is difficult and at which point we need your input in terms of which direction we want to go.
And actually, to your point, I do have this funny anecdote to kind of share. So at Microsoft, I a little bit similar to you in the way that you were just perfectly describing it, because I needed to break down problems. Right. Because otherwise, I wouldn't have the knowledge to make the product decisions to lead a roadmap. That was one of the problems, right? And so I was just trying to force myself to really get onboarded and train faster and get myself really caught up to speed with how the platform worked, how the entire end-to-end process of data was flowing from one end to another, and what the output was, and all that sort of stuff, and how we fit in the entire. So I worked on Microsoft Bing, so even how I fit in the entire Bing search ecosystem and everything. Yeah. And then and I wasn't hearing complaints or whatnot, but I just felt that growing pain of me being the frictional piece to the team because of that. And so I was just really trying to make sure that I was getting caught up to speed. And then eventually when I fully got myself kind of onboarded and I started, I felt like I was providing a little bit more value to the team, because all of a sudden I knew the product inside and out. I knew the technical aspects of it. So why, for example, we should move this direction versus that direction. All of a sudden, breaking down those pieces felt like it was coming in a little bit easier for me. But then on the flip side, the funniest part of the story is I go to plan view, right? I start jumping into the weeds about how the architectural decision should be made. I start kind of giving my opinion on it. Right. And all of a sudden the engineering director is like, don't worry, fine line, right? Let us decide it because we're the engineers, and let us, we'll do the technical analysis, the TA on it. Right. You just focus on why it needs to be built and what needs to be built. Okay. And let the how and the technical pieces of it, don't touch that piece. Let us do it, right? Otherwise, you would be going out of your line. And I think that to your point, I think that's when I realized every team, obviously you just have to adapt and compromise and you make that focus. But I guess that kind of leads me, before I go too much of a rant, to ask that next question. Yes. Which simply is kind of cross collaboration, in a sense that while we do want to make these, these differences a little bit slighter and close the gap, what are ways potentially we could try to solve that miscommunication, but better cross collaborate between devs and PMs, right? And I guess I could start as really from my experience. It's difficult because you want to understand what the expectations are from your developers from the get-go as a PM. Right. And I want to make sure, for example, okay, I want to provide the at least the most efficient amount of knowledge, and provide that efficient amount of knowledge to my developers so they know why they're building their stuff, but also what their expectations are from me, right? So I think that's probably a great first step, really, honestly, to better collaborate between ourselves. But there's also documentation, obviously, as we kind of spoke before. There's misalignments because if we don't document everything, we don't over communicate, then sometimes we still miss out on certain pieces, and that leads to these group pains of actual development later down the road. You missed this dependency, you didn't understand this timeline, I didn't think the product would look this way because you missed this one key piece. So I feel like it's difficult, and as much I know that we kind of talked about trying to just put everything into a good source of truth, trying to over communicate through this source of truth, but it's difficult, right? And I feel like there's no one trick solution for any of this.
No, absolutely not. And there's other things that you might not have mentioned based on your description, is that perhaps the direction is also changing while you're trying to figure out what you're trying to build as well. So what I noticed specifically for startups, because that's the experience I have the most with, is that a lot of times the product managers talk about here's a particular product they want to build and certain things, this is the direction they want to go. While they're speaking, while they were building the particular project, things have changed, whether from a director level or the CEO level or the investor level, things start to change, right? People are start trying to figure out, okay, what is this new direction? What is the new strategic direction is going to be, right? And from the different level, the information passes down all the way to down to the PM. So they're trying to struggle and try to figure out, okay, what does it mean to my current project? It is already underway. Do we stop what we're doing, or do we start pivoting towards some particular new direction? And when this happens frequently, information gets lost and your source of truth is nowhere to be seen. And what the vision is just living in random people's head. Like some people, and then becomes a big miscommunication. Everyone have a different idea of what the output needs to be. Right. So I think one of the more important thing is what you have mentioned is setting that expectation, being very, clear from the get-go. What is this project's expectation is, right? And once we have that clear goal that we're trying to meet, then I think it becomes much easier for the developer to work with the product manager to say, okay, we understand this is the goalpost. How can we work together to get there? I think setting that goalpost is one of the most absolutely crucial piece. And if goalposts start to change, forget about talking about the detailed implementation stuff, like forget going to the weeds and all that stuff. It's like, hey, you know what, team? There's going to be a change. We're going to switch our goalposts. Here's our new goalpost. Here's the new expectation, right? But if you start changing that goalpost constantly, I don't know if there's any cure out there that will help you to do anything. I mean, at that point, I think... I don't know. I think it's maybe from a product manager's perspective or leadership perspective, it is their job to make sure that there's not too much change that's happening, because software program or any product is not going to get anywhere if you just constantly change. You have to reduce the cadence of which you change your mind, I guess, in terms of understand your customers a little bit better, because it's much easier to fail an idea earlier on, then take that idea, start implementing it, and then say, you know what, this idea is not moving. I'm going to try a different one. So just fail the ideas much quicker at the beginning, and then communicate that and make sure things don't change too often. And I guess that's...
it makes perfect sense. I actually, and it's getting me excited to really talk about this because, it's a growing pain that I experience at work every day, and I'm sure it's for you as well, right? Like, especially because we both work for relatively medium-sized companies. There's always change from the top level down, right? In terms of product direction, in terms of architectural discussions.
Right.
And, I think that's one of the key pieces that PMs, at least in my opinion, they're really hard to really help facilitate that conversation, make sure that, number one, there's no friction in terms of the direction change will impact obviously the development process of it. But at the same time, they have to be there to really make sure that communication flows equally well in between all the factions. But then that's the problem, right? Because the moment that there's all constant change, you said moving goalposts, I can completely relate with that, because that means sunk cost in terms of development of what you're working on, sunk cost in, okay, these story points are not contributing to the product whatsoever. So why did we work on these story points in the first place? And even the epics, right? And at the epic level, which is not good. If you get to the epic level, then that's when you realize you need to be better at PMing. You need to make sure that there's no sunk cost in terms of the amount of effort you put in, because the one thing that my previous PM, I guess you could say coach as well as my manager at the time at Microsoft was, developer time is so expensive. So you got to absolutely make sure that you crack down on the communication of what you're building, why you're building it, and commit to it end to end.
That's right.
And see through it. And that is your job as a PM.
That's right.
And so I think like just kind of going through what you were describing is as long as we continue going in that direction and ensuring that a PM, when they get introduced into a team, they introduce those processes that would allow you to make sure that you could give them your trust, that the work that you're doing is contributing to the overall value of the product.
Right.
But at the same time, you're getting over communicated by the PM so that you understand exactly why you need to build it, how it needs to be built, the technical discussions of it, and those dependencies are cut. Like, I don't know about you, but it's always, from our organization, because we work so cross-collaboratively with so many different product teams,
Right.
there's always dependencies. And then when it comes to planning between quarters, it's like, did you commit to this so that you can support our, like, for example,
Right,
do you
right.
have this API ready so we can consume your API for this next quarter feature that we're building?
Right.
And if the team says no, and all of a sudden the PM is the one to blame. Because
Right.
at least from our culture, and I feel like that makes a lot of sense because that's what they're hired to do is facilitate those dependencies, make sure that the communication of how it's built and what's needed, right, to actually build the stuff is available. At least that's from my perspective, and I don't know. We should probably switch to the last topic here, but I don't know if you have like any thoughts or.
Right. I have an opinion. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but in a way, I'm not sure whether that is the PM's job to handle. It is PM's job to understand the dependency, but to prioritize the dependency, I think it might be a level up. It's about the company directions. For example, why should you prioritize your API over other people's API, right?
Yeah.
I think that is more a strategic question that needs to be answered from a director's level. And if the director is not answering that type of questions, what happens is that PMs all want to, everything that I own is prioritized. So now you get into politics. You need to have that strategic alignment on a director level with the CEO to know like, hey, this is the direction we're going to, and that is why this API is prioritized over the other set. So without that, everything is kind of fragmented. Everyone's like, hey, I need to take care of my product over yours. I don't care if you're not I don't care if I'm not producing for yours. I'm not making my API for you to consume. That's completely fine because I have something I need to push for. So once again, it comes down to a different strata of decision making, and it goes from the top down. And I think that's why there's the OKRs, right? Like it's about aligning company expectation over team expectation over individual expectation. Once you have that kind of alignment, things should go more smoothly, but I don't know. There's always friction between these different layers.
And on the bright side, at least, and to your point, at least that's like the best way to describe the value of OKRs in the first place is because there's that you need a framework or a structure of alignment to ensure that the top-down decision making goes hands-on to land, and it gets actually propagated to the actual epic and story level of work that developers are doing properly. But I guess I know we were going pretty deep into this entire topic, and we tend to ramble on about this a lot. And I'm sure if the audience loves to hear this type of stuff, that's great. We could definitely feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn and stuff. We could totally go deeper into it. But I guess we should just switch over to the last topic here because we are short on time. Really, my last thing here is really, especially because you come from a rather non-traditional background. Even electrical engineering is not software development.
That's right.
They're not asking you to build circuits. They're asking you to build code and commit code. And at the same time, it's interesting because, you went through that startup experience into a more kind of startup-y, medium-sized experience that's probably experiencing a little bit of growth and scaling pains, right?
Right.
So I guess my last question to you really and for the audience is, what's the best way to kind of crack into the technical role or even a tech job in general? It can be a PM, it can be developer, but just really trying to get inside that, that first tech job if for anyone coming from a non-traditional background, right? And then finally, I guess the latter question would just be like, what are those expectations? Should it be a startup, medium-sized company, large-sized company, all those types of things? Or should I just take the best offer I can get, right?
Right. I think the answer has to be, it depends. Depends on the economic environment. I feel like right now, it is extremely difficult to find a job, especially in the IT, and especially if you're a beginner. And on top of it, if you're pivoting from another non-traditional field into IT, you're faced with a lot of competitions who are new graduates from very good universities and very talented. So when you're competing with them, you really don't have a choice to pick. You take whatever that gets you closer to a technical development role or a PM role. For I think for technical, it's a little bit different from PM in my opinion, because I've seen a lot of PM started from customer support. So where they go into a particular domain, hired as the person that's customer facing, the most customer facing. They try to understand what the customer wants are, understand what their needs are, and then build a product sense. And then from within the company themselves, they become a product manager. So I think from a PM going through these type of non-traditional approach within the company, that might be a good way to become a PM. That's just from my observation. But from a technical perspective, I think it's more about, building your, it's about proving or it's about demonstrating to others that you are able to become a technical person if you're not from a technical background. For me, when in my first job, the interview question was actually quite difficult. It was actually the question was like, hey, given a picture of an animal, compute the number of spots on an animal.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, wow, this is complicated, but I was glad I had a course I took in electrical engineering, which was computer vision. So I kind of knew there are tools called like OpenCV that's out there that can do a lot of things I need to do. Obviously, I don't need to be an expert in computer vision to do those things. I can implement, I could try the APIs and whatnot. But even if I did not know about this particular OpenCV library, I could have Googled it and searched for like, hey, what's the most optimal approach? So sometimes what's the right way to say? Sometimes you got to be lucky to be able to get those kind of interview questions where you actually have the freedom to search up on the internet. A lot of these interviews doesn't exist nowadays. Normally, it's just lead code type of questions, and you just have to do a lot of lead code, trying to understand the data structure algorithm, and then to be able to apply to those type of companies. Another thing is definitely I find pretty helpful is to have the network, to be able to know people who you trust and they trust you in terms of be able to be a decent person who is hardworking, right? And then they can vouch for you in terms of if there's a company opening, they will vouch for you, and then you can get interviews much quicker than someone who is just applying through LinkedIn and things like that.
Makes sense. And I guess like kind of quick last minute follow-up question before we wrap things up fully is just, I guess that means that, once you're going through those notions, the large tech company, the medium-sized tech company, the startup. So from my experience, I always try to tell from a PM perspective, right? If you're really trying to crack the chicken and egg problem with PM, try to join a startup first. Simply because you're wearing multiple hats. So you're not necessarily going to have to rely on your fundamental PM skills, but rather, if you were managing, if you were kind of like you have a large, more expansive tool set where you're okay with doing a lot of different things, that's where your value applies more to a startup. And then you can grow into a PM skill set by growing with that startup and doing more PMing stuff as you continuously working along with that startup. So that's usually my piece of advice. And I feel like maybe that could even apply to developers too. Simply because like if you're coming from non-traditional background, but some code, obviously you're able to build some cool stuff. Forget the lead code questions. As long as you're able to show that you can build things and create the React app and build your first web app and show how the databases connect all the way to the front end, that's at least the minimum valuable piece that you can get, right?
Absolutely. I have to agree with you. It's just from my personal experience, I don't have that many project I was building. So for me, it's more about demonstrating that I'm capable on the interviews. And a lot of companies, even with startups, they ask you lead code questions. So you don't need to invest that much time into lead code, but you need to be pretty entry level in terms of lead code. You need to do at least a few easy, a few medium, even for startup companies. So it's unfortunate, but it is what it is.
Kind of the reality of today's market too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's perfect. Well, again, thank you again. I appreciate Young for this entire joyful conversation. I felt like I learned a lot, personally speaking, from your experience. So, and I hope the audience also learned a lot from our entire discussion. I know we got a little bit deep there, but it's glad because you get kind of that sense of fulfillment from going a little bit deep into like the whole discussion of things. So, once again, thank you for listening, and tune in for our next episode. And don't forget to follow PM Hive, and don't forget to follow Young on LinkedIn. We'll tag Young's profile in the LinkedIn description and everything. And until next time, cheers.
All right. Thank you so much, Kasey. Thank you for having me.
Awesome.